"Honey, I'm going to be a little late tonight, but hold dinner for me, please." When John Poindexter, a Pan Am employee, said those words over the phone to his wife, he did not yet know that it would take him a whole month to get home, and to make it, he would have to fly around the globe. As a crew member of the Boeing 314, he would complete the first commercial plane flight in history to circumnavigate the world. An extraordinary achievement that neither he nor anyone else even set out to accomplish. An accidental record that was forced by the outbreak of the Big War.
LaGuardia Tower, this is Pan American Clipper, November Charlie 18602, inbound from Auckland, New Zealand. Due to arrive, Pan American Marine Terminal LaGuardia in 7 minutes. Over.
Sorry, Pan American Clipper 18602, but say again. Confirm your departure point. Over.
I see an inbound from Auckland, New Zealand, by way of the long way around. Over.
The air controller had every reason to ask the pilot that question. The plane was requesting to land in New York right here, and New Zealand is right there, almost 15,000 kilometers apart. What even more strange is that the pilot said they flew the long way round, which means their route was even longer. No airline at the time had been flying such great distances. But this was not an ordinary flight. The radio called LaGuardia was the final moment of a record flight with a total length of more than 50,000 kilometers. The details and events of this journey are so incredible and fascinating that it may seem like the script of a Hollywood movie, but they all truly happened. A story that would make the headlines of every newspaper and magazine all over the world, if it weren't for the terrible war, which pushed this story far into the background. In the early days of commercial aviation, the sky belonged to flying boats. The concept of the flying boat appeared as a response to the state of the air transportation industry at the time. In the 1920s, commercial aviation was still in its infancy. First commercial airplanes were fragile and unreliable, but more importantly, the industry lacked the airfields that were required for landings and takeoffs. Meanwhile, there were already numerous ready-made seaports all over the world and vast areas of open water, such as lakes, rivers, and oceans. Why not develop a plane that would use water surfaces as runways? And so, the age of flying boats had begun. In a way, a flying boat was literally a boat hull with attached wings and engines. With time and technology advancement, the design of airplanes has been constantly improving, going from clumsy boats with wings to huge cruise liners in the sky. Not only did these planes inherit the ship-shaped fuselage from the sea liners, but also the decks, which featured spacious lounges, passenger cabins, restaurants, and bars. That was the time when air travel was a luxurious and unforgettable experience. The romantic perception of air travel, although somewhat faded nowadays, owes much of its image to that period of time. The 1930s marked the emergence of a legendary business empire, one of the largest and most famous airlines in history, Pan American. The company first began to operate as an airmail carrier between the US and Cuba, but then also started to make passenger flights to the Caribbean and later to South America. But the founder of the company, Juan Trippe, had way more ambitious plans: flights across the Pacific to Hawaii, Asia, and New Zealand.
As the sun dawned upon a new day, it also dawned upon a new era in aviation. The China Clipper, but 17 hours from San Francisco, passes Makapu Light in Hawaii, the first scheduled flight to these lands beyond the sunset.
At the time, no airplane was capable of making non-stop flights on such great distances, so the air fleet on these routes consisted only of flying boats. Juan Trippe, in homage to the elegant speed-sailing vessels from the 19th century, suggested to call all Pan Am flying boats Clippers. The first Clipper was named American, and this tradition to give each aircraft its own name has since been preserved by the company and became one of the bright and distinguishing features of Pan Am Airlines, as well as the pilots' white caps and black blazers that resembled the uniforms of a naval officer. Juan Trippe believed that seeing a formally attired seafaring professional in the pilot's seat would allow passengers to feel safer and more confident about the trip. Pan American was the first to introduce this type of pilot's uniform, which was later adopted by many other airlines all around the world. On December 1, 1941, Captain Robert Ford and his crew were getting ready to fly from San Francisco to Auckland, New Zealand. Robert, of course, was aware of the war that raged in Europe, but it was somewhere far away from the States. Also, like everyone else involved in the airline-specific trade, Ford was aware of deteriorating relations between the United States and Japan, but in general, For him and the rest of the crew, December the 1st was just a typical workday. Except maybe for John Poindexter. John was the chief flight radio officer for Pan Am's Pacific Division. Most of the time he worked in the office, but Ford's airplane had new radio equipment installed recently, and John wanted to try it out himself during the flight. So he asked Robert Ford to take him on the plane as one of the radio operators on the first and the shortest leg of the trip from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Speaking of the plane, Robert Ford was the captain of the California Clipper, Boeing 314, which is arguably the apex of the flying boat concept. More than 30 meters long with a wingspan of 46 meters, it was the biggest civil airplane of its time. The flight performance of the aircraft was tremendous, a maximum speed of 340 km per hour and an incredible range of 5,600 kilometers. The plane took up to 74 passengers on board who could enjoy the air travel while relaxing in the lounge areas, having their meals in the restaurants and sleeping in comfortable cabins. There was even a luxurious honeymoon suite in the tail section of the aircraft. Without having any problems, the California Clipper had reached Los Angeles, and John Poindexter had already called his wife, saying that he would soon be flying back home, when all of a sudden he was told that the second radio man of the California Clipper had been taken to the hospital with appendicitis. At the time, Pan Am regulations for long-haul routes strictly required 2 radio operators on board the Clipper. Unable to quickly find a replacement, John was induced to remain in the crew and stay in the radio man's seat for their entire flight to New Zealand. That same day, later in the afternoon, the Clipper took off as scheduled from Los Angeles and set course for Pearl Harbor. Somewhere far away in the Pacific, the Japanese battle fleet did the exact same thing. December 7, 1941. 3 days had passed since the Clipper left Pearl Harbor and was already on its final stretch to New Zealand when the radio operator told Captain Ford the news that he had just heard on the local radio station. Pearl Harbor has been attacked by Japan. No one wanted to believe that, but when they switched to Pan Am radio frequency, the message dispelled all their doubts. Pearl Harbor attacked, implement Plan A. With war looming on the horizon, before each flight, all captains of Pan Am Clippers received a sealed envelope, which they were to open at the proper time. Inside the envelope, they found an order to proceed to the nearest Allied airbase. With Pearl Harbor being attacked, the way back for them was now cut off, so this order meant that the California Clipper would continue the flight to Auckland. At Auckland, the crew received a new order from Pan Am headquarters. Normal return route cancelled. Strip all company markings and identifiable insignia from exterior surfaces. Proceed westbound soon as your discretion and deliver the plane to Marine Terminal in LaGuardia, New York. Good luck. To say that the crew was shocked by the message is an understatement. They were asked to do something that no commercial airplane had ever done before. The final destination of LaGuardia meant flying back to the US westbound from New Zealand, and that they had to create a new route which had never previously existed. They would have to fly thousands of miles across oceans and territories none of them were familiar with, service their aircraft somehow, get fuel and necessary supplies, and all of that amid the chaos of the war outbreak, where there was yet no clear understanding of which countries and territories were hostile and which were friendly. Add to this the fact that they simply had no money. As Ford later recalled, they were saved by an Australian banker who gave them $500 after learning their situation. The librarian was quite surprised when 4 men in uniform entered the Auckland Public Library and asked her to bring all the maps, navigation charts, and even geography textbooks they had available in the library. Those men were the crew of the California Clipper. After several hours of work with maps, the draft route was ready. The first stage of the journey, flying to Australia, was relatively easy and safe, but not the next stage. They decided that flying straight to Africa over the ocean on the very edge of the plane's maximum range was too risky, so they decided to reach Africa by flying northwest alongside the coast of Java and then India. This route would provide them with the chance of getting fuel and necessary supplies from British and Dutch forces that were stationed there, but on the other hand, taking that route would also mean a high risk of entering into possible war zones. Anyways, yet another couple of hours later, the plan had to be slightly changed, since Captain Ford received an urgent message from Pan American, asking to evacuate Pan Am employees and their families from the station in New Caledonia and bring them to Australia. This simple order, as it may have seemed at first, actually raised quite a difficult choice for Captain Ford. They had planned to load their plane with some spare parts and engines, but now, since they would need that space for passengers, they had to leave everything behind in New Zealand. Rescuing the Pan Am employees at the same time meant seriously decreasing their own chances of getting home. But Captain Ford made his decision and the Clipper wasting no time left Auckland and headed to New Caledonia. There was still part of the American flag left on the plane that they didn't have time to finish painting over because of the rush. A small detail that, as it turned out later, would save their lives. The flight to Darwin in Australia went relatively smoothly. Once they had landed, they immediately went to the seaport to find the fuel. But it wasn't just regular fuel they were looking for. The Boeing 314 was an amazing machine, but the airplane's high performance and long range were provided by powerful engines that required 100-octane gas. Boeing was the first commercial aeroplane that was designed to use this type of fuel to achieve a higher flight performance, something that only military aircrafts had been using before. In peacetime there weren't any issues with this fuel, but now there was no guarantee that they would be able to find it all along their route. What they saw in Darwin was chaos caused by fear of the expected Japanese invasion. To make matters worse, as the pilots then recalled, a freighter full of beer had just arrived in the harbor and temporarily paralyzed the remainder of the order in the seaport. Fortunately for them, the harbor master agreed to provide them with 100-octane gas, but things were not that easy. Since there were no fuel trucks available, the crew of the Clipper had to carry out all the fuel in regular jerry cans. The crew finished refueling the plane late at night, and then, early in the morning, the Clipper set the course for Indonesia. When the chief officer of the Royal Dutch Naval Air Station at Surabaya received a report about an unknown aircraft that was approaching the airbase, he immediately sent his fighters to intercept it. The base had been attacked by the Japanese bombers pretty much every day, and all the Dutch pilots were on a constant alert. He was told by radio that the incoming plane doesn't have any identification marks, and fighter pilots asked for permission to open fire, but for some reason, the commander hesitated. The tension was growing dangerously and things could have ended tragically if not for one pilot, who all of a sudden reported that he saw part of an American flag on the unknown plane. Captain Ford's rush to fly to New Caledonia to save the families of Pan Am employees eventually ended up saving them too. The Clipper landed safely outside the harbor, but there was one strange thing though. The patrol boat that had been sent to meet them for some reason did not approach them and stayed in the inner harbor a couple of kilometers away from the Clipper. Later, the commander of the airbase told Captain Ford that it was very fortunate that their radio communications worked today because they usually don't, otherwise the fighters would have shot them down without even giving it a second thought. And of course, he added, they were very concerned watching them land outside the breakwater, since that area is heavily mined against enemy ships. The Dutch welcomed the crew and provided them with all the necessary supplies, including spare parts for the plane, but there was bad news as well: fuel. They could not give them 100-octane aviation gas, which they themselves had in limited supplies and needed for their fighters, but they were more than willing to share regular automobile gas. It wasn't that the Boeing's engines couldn't run on regular gas, it's just that no one had ever tried that before, and there was no clear understanding of what it could eventually cause. The plane may fly normally, or the engines could overheat and explode right away, or the negative effect could appear later and the engines could fail over the ocean. It wasn't even clear if the engines on such fuel would be able to provide enough power for the plane to take off. But there wasn't much choice left. They decided to take the risk and use their remaining 100-octane aviation gas for takeoff, and then later in the flight, switch to fuel tanks filled with automobile gas. The next morning they left Surabaya. After gaining the altitude, holding their breaths and crossing their fingers, they switched the engines to automobile fuel. As Ford then recalled, at the beginning, the backfires and engine vibrations were so violent that it seemed the engines would simply fall out of the nacelles. But fortunately, the flight engineer was able to adjust the fuel mixture to the most optimal level, which decreased the severity of vibrations, and the Clipper set the course for Ceylon. When the dawn came, the Clipper had been in the air for 19 hours already. The navigator estimated that they would be approaching Ceylon soon. The clouds didn't help with the navigation, so they decided to go down below the edge of the cloud cover. The plane was now flying at a mere 100 meters, and the crew was searching the horizon looking for the coastline. Suddenly, the co-pilot noticed an object dead ahead of them. At first, they thought it was a whale, but as they were coming closer and closer, the silhouette of the whale became more and more distinct, as did the conning tower on its back, on which they now suddenly saw was Aurora, the symbol of the rising sun, and also sailors running towards the deck gun. The Japanese submarine didn't seem to expect to encounter an airplane either. The pilots pulled the yokes vigorously, but the heavy Boeing flying on the automobile gas was very reluctant to gain the altitude. The seconds that ticked by while they were seeking cover in the clouds, in those moments probably felt like an eternity. It was right after the plane had disappeared in the clouds when they heard several explosions in the air below and behind them. Fortunately, no damage was done to the plane, and an hour later, the plane safely landed in Ceylon. In Ceylon, they had to stay a little longer than they had planned to. In half an hour after they took off and headed towards the next point of their journey, one of the engines suddenly exploded. The consequence of bad fuel mixture eventually revealed itself. Fortunately for them, it didn't happen while they were flying somewhere far away over the ocean. Pilots were able to keep the wounded plane in the air long enough to make it back to Ceylon, but the crew of the California Clipper had to celebrate Christmas while still in Ceylon, repairing the damaged plane. The next landings were in Karachi, Bahrain, Khartoum, and finally landing in Leopoldville. The flight along this route was relatively uneventful. Relatively, if we don't take into account the Arabs shooting at them as they flew over the Mecca, and in general, flying in a Clipper over land always meant great risk, because any emergency landing on the ground would have meant serious damage to the plane since the Clipper literally had no landing gear. According to Captain Ford, Leopoldville was one of the most enjoyable parts of their trip. After landing, the staff at the local Pan Am station treated them with a cold beer. But the best part was that they could provide them with enough 100-octane gas for the long flight across the Atlantic Ocean. Their next destination was Natal in Brazil, but since the distance to Natal was 5,600 kilometers, which was exactly the maximum range of their Clipper, that meant that even the slightest deviation in the course or just a headwind would mean they wouldn't be able to reach the coast of Brazil. As a solution, Captain Ford decided to load the plane with extra fuel. Sure, it would require much longer takeoff run to get the plane airborne, but more fuel would definitely help them cross the ocean safely. But the decision that was supposed to give them more chances to survive instead might have cost them their lives. Knowing that the plane was overloaded but having no other options, the crew began to prepare the Clipper for takeoff. They found a straight stretch of the Congo River that was about 5 kilometers long. The river ended with multiple waterfalls and rapids running through a maze of canyons, but based on their calculations, 5 kilometers should be enough for the Clipper to get airborne. When everyone was ready, Captain Ford put engines on maximum power and the plane rushed down the river. But Ford quickly discovered that he couldn't lift the overweight plane in hot and thin air. The maximum time that was allowed to keep Clipper's engines on full power was only 90 seconds. If the time is exceeded, you face the risk of engines overheating and exploding. They were already running beyond that time, but the plane simply refused to take off. To make matters worse, they were getting closer and closer to the waterfalls. At the very last moment, somehow Ford managed to lift the heavy plane in the air, but only a few feet above the water. Luckily for them, it was enough to fly over the rim of the gorge. But now the plane began to descend into the canyon, and in just a few seconds they were flying along narrow rock walls of the Congo Valley, just a few feet above the water. It may seem that the situation couldn't get any worse, but while approaching the shallow turn in the canyon, Ford suddenly discovered that the plane wasn't responding to controls. What happened was that the extra fuel in wing tanks bent the wings slightly, but just enough so the aileron cables got jammed. Captain Ford immediately pounded the rudder pedals and just in time to barely avoid the crash. The Boeing's engines roared on the maximum throttle for 3 minutes already instead of 90 seconds that were allowed. Pilots pushed the rudder pedals vigorously, making turns to avoid the canyon rocks, and probably in that moment it may have seemed that the gorge would never end. Fortunately, the Boeing's engines didn't fail, and finally they managed to break free from the canyon. Slowly gaining altitude, the Clipper set the course for Brazil. 23 hours and 35 minutes in the air, a new record for Boeing 314 and the long-awaited landing in the harbor of Natal. The local Brazilian authorities asked the crew to leave the plane so they could sort out some formalities and also spray the plane for yellow fever. Within a couple of hours, the Clipper was again in the air heading for Trinidad. But it was not until after takeoff that the crew discovered that the Brazilian fumigators had sprayed for yellow fever not just the interior of the plane, but also the interior of the captain's safe, making all the documents and money disappear. Fortunately, the next stop for the Clipper was at Pan Am Station in Trinidad, so it wasn't a big deal now. On January 6, 1942, at 5:54 a.m., John Poindexter gave a signal to Captain Ford that he got set on LaGuardia Terminal's radio channel.
LaGuardia Tower, this is Pan American Clipper, November.
The funny irony was that after making such a long trip, they had to spend another hour circling over New York City, since the regulations didn't allow landing at the terminal until after 7 a.m. For them, it may have been the longest hour of their entire trip. With landing in New York City, the California Clipper became the first commercial airplane to circumnavigate the world. 209 hours in the air, more than 50,000 kilometers, 18 landings in 12 countries on 5 continents.
Captain Robert Ford and his valiant, resourceful crew saved the great Pacific Clipper for war service after Pearl Harbor by completing the first circuit of the globe by air on a secret roundabout course over dangerous mountains and desert.
For this achievement, California Clipper was later renamed to Pacific Clipper, and together with the other Pan Am Clippers, continued its service, although now performing military missions. But despite its meritorious service, the end of the war was also the end of the age of flying boats. During the war, a large number of military airfields were built around the world, which now began to be actively used by commercial aviation. Complex and expensive flying boats were no longer needed. A short but incredibly bright age of flying boats had come to an end. Now the golden age of high speeds and sleek airliners was emerging, an age where Pan Am would long be one of the main trendsetters in the air travel industry. But that's another story altogether. The journey of the California Clipper was so rich in various events that it's simply impossible to cover them all in one video. If you want to know more about the adventures of Captain Ford and his crew, I highly suggest you check out the amazing article "The Plane That Accidentally Flew Around the World" by John Bull, which inspired me to create this video. But beyond that, the most definitive account of the California Clipper's journey would be the fascinating book "The Long Way Home" by Ed Dover. A former Pan Am employee, Ed Dover actually spent time with Captain Robert Ford himself, collecting the priceless details about California Clipper's incredible journey, like crew conversations, for instance. I will leave the link below in the description so you can check it out. The perfect gift for either yourself or a friend of yours who loves aviation. That's all for now, thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye.